Well, hello, students. Moving on to Wednesday already. I want to continue on with diversity. And now that you've reviewed about different generational types of diversity, I want to talk about communication style and gender, moving on to page 390 of your book. And it talks about Dr. Deborah Tannen, who is an anthropologist and linguist and a professor of communication. And she really goes into how understanding differences in gender are important to effective communication. So we ask ourselves the question, well, what does gender have to do with diversity and communication? Well, it has a lot to do with it because there has been numerous studies that say that men and women process information differently, and that processing really affects the way we communicate. And so some of it could be demographic differences in culture, but focusing in on gender, for example, women have a different communication style, as I just mentioned, from men. And really, a lot of it is culturally oriented. Um, if you look at table 11 2, it looks at different communication style preferences between men and women. Men use the pronoun I, women usually use the pronoun we. Um, most men display confidence in their ideas, women downplay confidence in ideas. I don't necessarily know whether I agree with that or not. Maybe it's true to a degree, but again, it could also be attributed to how we were brought up. Our genders have a lot to do with values that are established in the household. Men make statements, women ask questions. Um, Here again, um, that through time has changed. I will honestly say that, in my opinion, based on my experiences as a teacher and working in the corporate world, that I think that those are on equal footing. I think men ask a lot of questions, women ask a lot of questions. Men make statements, women make statements. It all depends on how you look at things. Men challenge others, women apologize to others. Here again, that is very stereotyped, and I don't necessarily know if I agree with that, but here again, this is the consensus that this chart has come up with. Men focus on achievements, women avoid talking about their own achievements. I see that changing over time, honestly. Men are more direct, women are more indirect. That again, I question that. Men often criticize, women often compliment. That may be true. Um, there's a great study in how um, women look at things and bring out the good in other people. Um, Criticism is more of a stereotype of men. I think there are really good men leaders out there that might think differently about that. Um, in my podcast on choicetolead.com, I recently interviewed Candy O'Terry, who for many years was a radio talk show host and also a DJ. Um, Singer songwriter, has many, many different talents. And she talks about successful women in the workplace. And the idea is listen to that interview. It's really a good interview. Anyone can get into it and look at it. I should say they should listen to it, their podcasts, and you will see how women have really changed the dynamic and changed the footprint for 2020 leadership. Styles that are different in communication, promotions, salaries, negotiations. Here again, I'm in your book, page 391. Project work, performance evaluation. We're going to go on to talking about that next. So let's just focus on communication right now. Page 392 talks about communication in organizations. Um, Obviously, we know how important communication is, and I think that the more transparency there is in communication, the better we are together in solving problems, offering solutions, making decisions, delivering different types of news, influence, motivating, educating. It's all stated here in your book. But here, we're going to be looking at 3 models of communication. And communication in and of itself is a certain process that technically means translating information from sender to receiver. That usually isn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem is, what did the sender have in mind? What did the receiver have in mind? And when they received the message from the sender. So all of this is broken down in the process of sending and receiving, and that's usually explained as coding, C-O-D-I-N-G. So I think a lot of our values are put into place when we make judgments about how communication is made. So there are 3 approaches to communication: the sender to receiver model, the co-orienting model, and then the conversational learning model. So the sender receiver model really just simply looks at how facts and information are communicated from the sender to the receiver. Messages all should be clear. As long as the message is clearly communicated, it usually will be taken the same way it's intended to be taken from the sender once it gets to the receiver. A lot of things interfere with the communication process, and that has to do with one word: interpretation. If you're dealing from a diverse standpoint in multicultural environments, the interpretation may be literally taken, may be different than what what the sender intends to send as a message. How it's broken down, how it's decoded. Encoding and decoding can sometimes be day and night, apples and oranges, 2 different things. So, communication, as your book states on 392, is a complex process and involves many different things. So there's a lot of moving parts in the communication. And if it's face-to-face communication, you have to include verbal and nonverbal cues. And one of the things that's really important that's brought out in your book here is on 392, it says that communication is a process of co-orienting, understanding intended messages and how they can be interpreted differently. Co-orienting means that communicators and receivers got to come out of their comfort zones in interpretation. And you really have to get into understanding the experiences and perceptions of others. The third explanation for communication is what we call conversational learning. And when you take this approach, it explains how people use conversations to improve understanding of their differences. And we normally refer to that as understanding communications and the problem of what we call parochialism. And you can look up that term in your book, but parochialism happens when someone's views, all right, another as though they are the same as oneself. In other words, when you get the message sent to you, you automatically assume that the person is going to think the same way you do, and you don't really take into account their differences, their orientation, as what they call parochialism here. Conversational learning focuses on making sure that you understand what someone else does, how they're going to interpret it without judging them. In other words, you take into consideration that they will interpret differently and have to do that within their own comfort zone. So here again, and these are points I brought up earlier, you have to agree to disagree. Okay, that is phase one of today's lecture.